At the end of the First World War, the victorious Allies had severely punished Germany. The Treaty of Versailles had forced the Germans to give up huge areas of national land and all overseas colonies, reduced armed forces to practically nothing, and pay a vast sum of money called reparations to France, Britain, and Belgium. Harsh terms of peace fueled the smoldering embers of the First World War and burst into the flames that became the Second World War. The year is 1932. It's an election year. The Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, promises to tear up the Treaty of Versailles, build up the armed forces, provide jobs for everybody, and reunite the fatherland. Hitler's simplest but most sinister idea involves convincing the Germans that the Jews are to blame for all of Germany's problems. Brown-shirted Nazi thugs called stormtroopers beat up Jews in the streets and destroy their property. As Hitler tightens his grip on Germany, other European nations are also moving towards totalitarian or fascist states. Fascism is a system of government that glorifies the state and a single all-powerful ruler. Any opposing views are outlawed.
You had a leader who was above reproach, whom you didn't vote in and out of office, who took office and stayed there forever. So individual rights, individual liberties are suppressed under fascist rule. And the idea is that the most important thing for an individual is to give his life for the state.
Fascism became popular in European nations that were suffering economic depression after World War I. In Italy, fascist Benito Mussolini wanted to build a new Roman Empire. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin is creating a military superpower and forcing the nation to obey his commands. During his reign of terror, 14 million peasants died as a result of a famine he created with artificial food shortages. His secret police killed another 7 to 9 million in purges of the disloyal. In the 1930s, the fascists and communists swarmed across Europe. General Francisco Franco, with Hitler's and Mussolini's help, took over Spain by way of a bloody civil war. Hitler's armies marched into Austria and Czechoslovakia. Hitler and Stalin signed a treaty of friendship, then carved up Poland. German dive bombers, sirens screaming, swept over Poland in advance of fast-moving panzer tanks in a blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Next, the Germans invaded Denmark and Norway. A month later, panzers rolled through Holland and Belgium in an end run around the French fortifications. After France surrendered in June 1940, almost all of Western Europe was under Axis control. To pound the British into submission, Hitler launched an all-out air war.
The Nazis had begun their shattering blitz on Britain.
Hello, America. This is Edward Murrow speaking from London. There were more German planes over the coast of Britain today than at any time since the war began.
As the Battle of Britain raged overhead, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill rallied the British people on the radio, just as Roosevelt had done for Americans during the Great Depression with his fireside chats. The British people, Churchill said, faced a time of blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Meanwhile, in the North Atlantic, German submarines in wolf packs threatened to strangle Great Britain by cutting it off from the rest of the world. With France defeated and British forces tied up in North Africa, Hitler stunned the world once again. On June 22, 1941, 120 German divisions poured into the Soviet Union and quickly penetrated all the way to Stalingrad. the Soviet Union turned to the United States for help. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was quick to recognize the implications of dictators seizing power in Europe and Asia. He believed that if Britain fell and the Axis powers were victorious, freedom and democracy would be in danger everywhere. But many Americans didn't want anything to do with another war in Europe. In the 1930s, a majority of Americans believed that U.S. participation in World War I had been a mistake. Many believed that the country's involvement had been manipulated by big business. This popular belief gave rise to Senate hearings led by Senator Nye to investigate the role that businesses had played in the United States decision to enter World War I. The hearings found that U.S. businesses had not conspired to trick the country into entering the war in order to make more money. But the hearings did expose that more than 1/4 of the top 100 corporations were doing business with Nazi Germany. We do not inquire into the use of the products, one chemical industry official stated. We are interested in selling them. To prevent the United States from being drawn into another war in Europe, Congress passed a series of neutrality acts. Roosevelt thought this ostrich-like legislation was wrong. He wanted the United States to help Britain defeat the Nazis without being drawn into the war. After Italy invaded Ethiopia and Japan invaded China in 1937, he made a stirring call to embargo or quarantine such aggressors. But those who wanted to stay neutral, called isolationists, continued to fight to keep the United States out of the conflict. After Hitler's conquest of France in June of 1940, FDR had to figure out how to help Great Britain without breaking the neutrality laws. In September 1940, during his campaign for an unprecedented third term as president, Roosevelt authorized the transfer of 50 old American destroyers to the British in exchange for a few Atlantic naval bases in the so-called Destroyers for Bases deal. Re-elected in 1940, FDR got around the law against aiding the Allies by lending rather than selling arms to Great Britain and convinced Congress to lay out $7 billion to cover the cost of his Lend-Lease program.
I ask this Congress for authority and for funds sufficient to manufacture additional munitions and war supplies of many kinds to be turned over to those nations which are now in actual war with aggressor nations.
Not surprisingly, the German Führer was less than pleased. Shipping arms to the Allies on whatever terms put the United States in the same position that the country had been in 25 years earlier, as a neutral supplier on the eve of World War I. In a sense, history was repeating itself. German U-boats once again went on the attack, and the United States vessels once again became the targets. When a U-boat sunk the U.S. destroyer Reuben James off Iceland, the United States neutrality went to the bottom with its crew. 2 weeks later, Congress voted to arm merchantmen, and the American people began to prepare themselves for another war.
Sunday, December 7th, 1941.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor stunned the nation. On December 8, 1941, President Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
A half hour later, Congress obliged. 3 days later, Germany and Italy honored their pledge to Tokyo and declared war on the United States. The United States, in turn, joined Britain and the Free French under de Gaulle against the Berlin-Rome-Tokyo axis. But why, when the United States was focusing on events in Europe, did it get attacked by Japan? The United States and Japan had been squaring off for a long time. Japan's desire to create what it called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere collided with America's insistence on equal access, or the open door, to China. When Japan invaded China in 1937, FDR condemned their aggression. Japan wanted to dominate all of East Asia and the Pacific. In 1940, Japan had signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, providing added strength for future aggressions. By the spring of 1941, Japanese troops controlled French Indochina.
The Roosevelt administration attempted to force Japan to cease its operations in Indochina and also to force the Japanese out of China by slapping a very strict embargo on oil and raw materials to Japan. Since the United States was the world's greatest oil exporting nation at the time, and also was exporting steel and iron and so forth to Japan, this had a critical impact on Japan's economy.
At some point, the Japanese think our economy will be brought to its knees if we don't get these things from the United States. So what we have to do is to carve out our own sphere of influence, not only in China, but in all of Southeast Asia. And in order to do that, we've got to hit the United States hard so the United States can't continue to hurt us.
Attacking Pearl Harbor was the means by which they hoped to ensure their success. In the days after Pearl Harbor, Japanese troops invaded the British colonies of Hong Kong and Malaya, swept across the American-controlled Philippine Islands, and took the American-owned islands of Guam and Wake Island. In early 1942, the United States faced an incredible challenge. As the arsenal of democracy, it would have to supply war materials to its allies in Europe, rebuild its Pacific fleet, and wage its own war against Germany, Italy, and Japan, all at the same time. Realizing that an army marches on its stomach, American farmers rolled up their sleeves and during World War II reaped record-breaking billion-bushel wheat harvests. To do so, the U.S. turned to a neighbor for help. Mexico sent workers called braceros, or strong arms, to work in U.S. agriculture and industry. New machinery and improved fertilizers helped accelerate the change of agriculture into big business.
World War II affected the economy in many ways. In fact, World War II really ended the Depression, and the war economy begins before the United States enters the war.
The U.S. government saw that the war was coming, and beginning at the end of 1937 into early 1938, the United States embarked on a program of rearmament, which involved rebuilding the Navy, which had been seriously cut back according to arms control treaties after World War I, and also to look at ways of increasing what was called industrial mobilization for the United States to meet what looked to be a possible global war.
The federal government pumped as much as $250 million a day into wartime production. In order to speed the industrial conversion to wartime production, the President set up the War Production Board, which managed industrial output for the war machine.
When a war is coming, you try to prepare for it by coming up with schemes so that automobile factories can be converted to produce not automobiles that are used in our day-to-day life, but tanks and trucks and even airplanes that in turn will be used in the war effort.
By the end of the war, U.S. industries had manufactured 40 billion bullets, 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2.25 million machine guns, and 76,000 ships. To accomplish these unprecedented feats of industrial production, factories in the United States employed millions of workers who worked long hours for large paychecks. Americans on the home front were financially better off than they had been since the 1920s.
You give us the scrap. We'll turn it into tanks.
In order to conserve valuable resources necessary for the war effort, the new Office of Price Administration imposed rationing and price controls on critical items. Every family in the United States had a book of ration stamps for meat, butter, gasoline, and other essentials of daily life. All over the United States, children contributed to the war effort. They gathered and bundled newspapers, carried kitchen grease to the butcher shop to be turned into glycerin for gunpowder, collected scrap iron, and saved their pennies to buy war saving stamps at school to pay for tanks, jeeps, and airplanes.
We were told that one stamp would buy 12 bullets, and so we licked stamps to lick the Japs, and we thought we were taking part in the war effort.
Men, women, and children did their part to conserve and to supply essential materials for the war effort. The Second World War not only changed how people lived, but where they lived. 15 million Americans put on uniforms during the war and headed for training camps and their assignments at home and abroad.
Women also joined the armed forces. They joined the WACs, the Women's Army Corps. They joined the WAVES, which was the women's branch of the Navy, and they also joined the Women's Army Air Corps. Now, most of these women did not serve overseas. The idea behind putting women into the military was that they would do the support jobs so that the men could be freed up to go into combat. So most of the women who were in the WACs or in the WAVES actually served at home in clerical and administrative functions. There was, however, a group of women pilots who trained Army pilots to go into combat. They trained them, but they were not members of the military, and they were not allowed to join the military. So they were never eligible for GI Bill benefits after the war.
Millions of job seekers headed for the centers of transportation and industry. California alone saw its population grow by nearly 2 million. Boom towns like Los Angeles, Seattle, Baton Rouge, and Detroit attracted hundreds of thousands of would-be workers. 70,000 people poured into Washington, D.C. in the first year after Pearl Harbor to administer new agencies created. During World War II, big government became a permanent fixture of American life. Back in 1938, Roosevelt had called the South the nation's #1 economic problem. FDR used the war to accelerate the region's economic development. The states of the old Confederacy received a disproportionate share of defense contracts, including nearly $6 billion of federally financed industrial facilities. No group was more affected by the war than Southern blacks. 750,000 left their farms for jobs in southern cities. Renewing the great outward migration of World War I, 1.5 million left their homes to seek employment in the war plants of the West and North. The war also revitalized African Americans' struggle for racial equality. How, they asked, could America fight a war in the name of freedom and democracy, while at home it still discriminated against African Americans and other minorities?
One of the real problems that Americans had in fighting the war was that they were fighting the Nazis, a racist government which was well known for its horrendous racial policies. The American racial policies are not all that good either, because Americans have a racially segregated society, and it's very, very hard to maintain the racial segregation in the United States when you're being pressed to fight an enemy who is known for his racism. So what the war does is put pressure on the ancient bad racial attitudes of white America, and it ultimately leads to the desegregation of the armed forces, and I think ultimately to the civil rights movement.
In 1940, to protest discrimination in the nation's war industries, labor leader A. Philip Randolph threatened to march 100,000 blacks on Washington, D.C. To prevent this, FDR issued an executive order creating the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which outlawed racial discrimination in America's defense industries. African Americans would make significant economic gains during the war, moving up the occupational ladder into skilled jobs previously reserved for whites only. But their advances did not take place without conflict. The movement of minorities into the nation's cities increased long-standing racial tensions. In 1943 alone, 250 racial conflicts exploded in 47 different cities. In Detroit, 30 hours of rioting left 34 people dead and property damage in excess of $2 million.
A number of Native American Indians served in the Army, and some of them were in famous units. There was a famous Navajo unit that used their native language to fool the enemy, because they instead of using code, they talked in their native language, and the Japanese could never figure out what they were doing, and so never broke their Navajo language. In other cases, Native Americans were used as scouts.
The economic opportunities created by the war had unpredictable, surprising results. The new jobs created by the war would change millions of women's lives. By the end of the war, over a third of the American labor force was female.
More than any other single event, I think, in this country, World War II changed women's lives. There was a whole huge war production machine that had to be built. So women, for the first time, moved in massive numbers into industrial labor. Everyone has heard of Rosie the Riveter, looking jaunty with her welding equipment in one hand, getting ready to go to work. This is a stereotype, but it was also real. Women, for the first time, earned high wages in men's jobs, and they were able to save money. Even women who didn't work in the factories, many of them enjoyed a newfound independence, because if you were married and your husband was a soldier and he went off to war, you were in charge of the family finances, you were in charge of major purchases, you were in charge of the house. Many women who had never made these decisions before started to make them in the 1940s, and so they too became much more independent.
During the emergencies and crises of war, a nation may take steps that it will later regret. Fearing a Japanese invasion and sabotage of its West Coast war plants, the federal government rounded up 112,000 Japanese Americans and placed them in internment camps in isolated regions of the West. There they lived behind barbed wire under armed guards for the duration of the war. 2/3 of these people were native-born U.S. citizens, and many lost everything they owned when they were taken from their homes. Japanese Americans faced an uphill battle in convincing the nation of their patriotism. To prove their patriotism, over 8,000 evacuees worked on Western farms. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed of Japanese American volunteers from both Hawaii and the internment camps, would become the most highly decorated unit in the history of the U.S. Army for its bravery on the battlefields of Europe. During the dark early years of the war, U.S. prospects looked pretty bleak. The Japanese were continuing their advances in the Pacific, and Hitler was cementing his hold on Europe. The entertainment industry helped boost the country's spirits by producing movies and songs that celebrated the way of life and fighting spirit in the United States.
We went to the movies to look at the newsreels and see what was going on. Because there was no immediate television in those days, the visual part of the war only came later. If there was a big battle, you didn't see the pictures from it until a couple of weeks later in a newsreel or when Life magazine came out. Everybody was united, and everybody knew exactly who the enemy was. There was evil and good, and it was carefully divided.
At a meeting at Tehran, Persia, in November 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill promised Stalin they would open a second front in Europe by the following summer. After beating the Germans and Italians in North Africa, the Allies jumped across the Mediterranean to Italy, where they stood firm in the face of fierce German resistance. While the Soviet Army engaged the bulk of the German army on the Eastern Front, the Allies prepared the invasion of France. June 6, 1944, D-Day. A combined force of American, English, Canadian, and Free French troops invade France in the largest amphibious assault in world history. 4,000 transports, escorted by 600 ships, sailed across the English Channel and landed 175,000 men on the beaches of Normandy. In retaliation, Germany rained V-1 flying bombs on London. In the months following the Normandy invasion, the Allies converged on Germany. In one last desperate counterattack, German troops drove back the U.S. troops during the cold winter of 1944 in the Battle of the Bulge. But in the end, the Allied lines held and soon renewed their drive into the heart of the Third Reich. As Allies fought their way into German-held territory, they liberated Nazi-run concentration camps. At some, the air was still filled with the smell of burning flesh, the end of the process that exterminated close to 6 million Jews and millions of Poles, Gypsies, homosexuals, people with disabilities, and other groups the Nazis deemed undesirable.
President Roosevelt is dead.
On April 12, 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died.
There is the flag-draped coffin resting on this black caisson.
Days later, angry Italians killed fascist leader Mussolini. As Soviet troops stormed into Berlin on April 30th, Adolf Hitler took his own life. 7 days later, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. In the Pacific, the United States had kept the bully at bay until the defeat of Hitler and Mussolini. The war in the Pacific had been sweaty, grimy, bloody, and vicious. In 1942, the Japanese had swept through the British colonies in Asia and threatened to invade India. American General Douglas MacArthur led a fierce American defense of the Philippines. But the Japanese trapped the Americans in the narrow Bataan Peninsula and forced them to surrender. As MacArthur left, he vowed, "I shall return." Thousands of Americans and Filipino troops died in the terrible death march from Bataan to prison camps in the north of the islands. Once there, thousands more would die as well. Intent on destroying the American Pacific Fleet, the Japanese steamed toward Midway Island, where the American fleet intercepted and defeated them in the first battle fought entirely by planes from aircraft carriers. The two fleets never saw each other. After the battle at Midway, the United States began the long, slow process of attacking Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. It was known as island hopping. They began with Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, where the Japanese kept up fanatical resistance for 6 months before finally giving in. It cost tens of thousands of U.S. lives to take the Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. Capturing the one small island of Okinawa in June 1945 cost 12,500 U.S. lives in a battle that was supposed to take 45 days but lasted 80. As U.S. forces advanced toward Japan, a small group of scientists working in secret were about to change the course of world history. Out in Los Alamos, New Mexico, Robert Oppenheimer was heading the top-secret Manhattan Project to develop an atomic bomb before the Germans. In July 1945, new President Truman met with Stalin and British leaders at the Potsdam Conference, held near Berlin. There Truman learned that American scientists had successfully exploded an atomic device in the desert near Alamogordo, New Mexico. President Truman now had to decide whether this awesome new weapon should be used. Truman created a special committee of high-level policymakers to consider the options. It recommended unanimously that the bomb be dropped. A number of scientists disagreed. But after a second scientific committee recommended that the bomb be used, the president made his decision. On July 25, 1945, President Truman authorized the only use of nuclear weapons in world history. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, the superfortress Enola Gay dropped the first bomb on the city of Hiroshima. When it landed a fireball millions of degrees at its center, it erased 4 square miles of city. In 9 seconds, it killed at least 70,000 people and destroyed 62,000 buildings. The mushroom cloud from the explosion rose 40,000 feet into the air. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing 80,000 people. The next day, Japan asked for terms of surrender. President Truman declared August 14th as Victory over Japan, or VJ Day. 2 million people surged into New York City's Times Square to rejoice. All across the United States, streets were jammed with crying, laughing, and shouting people. Many people ducked into churches to say a prayer of thanks. On September 2, 1945, the Japanese formally surrendered on the U.S. battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past.
The Second World War had cost the lives of more than 400,000 Americans. More than 670,000 had been wounded, and countless others emotionally scarred. Demobilization of U.S. forces brought millions of changed men and women home to an equally changed society. The war had accelerated the movement towards bigness, the government, the economy, and the military. In the decades following the end of the Second World War, the United States would experience unprecedented prosperity and would emerge as the leader of the Western world. Despite such power, many Americans remained uneasy. Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and its apparent desire to expand its influence into Asia and other parts of the globe concerned U.S. policymakers. In response to the Soviet threat, the United States would maintain and then expand its military presence abroad, assuming the mantle of the protector of the free world.